One, two, three. 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 Okay. Unfortunately, we don't have the microphone today. We'll lecture from here. Hello, everyone. Hi. Okay. Let's continue our story. Let's study economic growth after 1950. The first thing we always have to ask is, why study this topic? Why study economic growth after 1950? And the short answer to this is that before explaining the causes of economic growth, we first need to clarify and study the patterns of the growth in the last 6 decades. In other words, we basically need to find out what happened first, what were the trends, and then in the remaining weeks, try to explain them. My lecture is divided to 4 parts. I deal with 4 different regions, countries. The first one is what happened to the West after 1950. The second one is the marvelous story of East Asian miracle after the Second World War. The third one is Africa since 1950, the cliches about this topic. Is Africa that miserable? Is Africa a rising star? Does it mean to talk about Africa as a country like the way we see it in the Starbucks? And finally, the dominant story of your lifetime, India and China. So let's begin by the West after 1950. Let's look at the income levels right after the World War II. Unsurprisingly, the United States has the highest income per capita, relatively unaffected by the war. Then United Kingdom, France, Germany is completely devastated by the war. So big gap in terms of income per capita. Germany has an income per capita of $4,000, while the US income per capita is about $18,000. $4,000 per year, $18,000. A huge gap. Japan is way behind, and Russia is as rich as France and Germany. Okay? This is Britain after the war, London after the war. I think the better example is Germany after the war. Complete destruction. Okay. So basically all the machineries, all the roads, all the buildings you built per person have been destroyed. Therefore, your income level has dropped. We're going to see. Okay. In other words, the level of capital stock per person vanished during the war. Okay. Especially in Germany. After the World War II, you got the dawn of the Cold War. Superpower rivalry between the US and the communist bloc. Let's see what happened in the Western bloc. Now, before that, let's look at the context. What was happening at the global level? First, the Marshall Plan. Can anyone elaborate on that? What was Marshall Plan? Yes?
Provision of credits to the European countries in order to help them re-establish their economies.
Provision of?
Credits.
Aid. It was aid given by who? US to the European countries. What were the main motives? Sorry? Prevent the communist takeover. The Iron Curtain, in the words of Winston Churchill, was spreading. And the US urgently thought that we need to rescue countries like Germany. We shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the First World War, right? We shouldn't bleed Germany by austerity. We should actually help them to prevent their co-option by the communist countries. Hence, the US provided a lot of aid for these countries, basically to rebuild the capital stock, rebuild the roads that had been destroyed, rebuild the factories and the buildings to the previous pre-war levels. Then you had basically the creation of the World Bank. The initial idea was again to help the reconstruction of the Western European countries, the infrastructure projects. The IMF was basically set up to provide the financial chaos before the World War II, basically. And you had GATT, which subsequently turned into WTO, and that was a global international trade regimes, and the Western capitalist bloc wanted to ensure trade between countries because they thought that it's one of the main reasons that could basically preempt a communist penetration of those countries. Interesting, one of the reasons the US allowed the European countries to establish the common market in the 60s was the Cold War. So think about the European countries. It's a big custom union. A bunch of countries get together. They eliminate the tariff barriers between each other, but they erect tariff barriers for outsiders, for the US, for the other countries. And the US allowed the European countries to do that because they thought that it actually helps the integration of the Western European capitalist countries. And finally, you had the Bretton Woods international regime. Anyone wanted to elaborate on that? What was the main feature of Bretton Woods? Jonathan, yes? Yes?
To provide a single, well, they back the US dollar with gold, and that became the primary currency of the world, so everybody could always get their currency back in gold.
Exactly. So the US fixed its currency against gold, and the other countries fixed their currency to the dollar. What was the advantage of having a fixed currency between different countries? Think about the UK today. The pound is volatile. What are the negative effects of this? Trisco, yes? Yeah. To create a stable investment and trade climate. Imagine that you're trading, you're importer or exporter with another country, and the value of your currencies fluctuate all the time. There's a lot of uncertainty. But if you fix the currencies against each other, you eliminate that uncertainty. You can easily trade with each other, and you can easily invest in the other country, and vice versa. That was the global context after the World War II. Basically, all these institutions or organizations were built to make sure that we're not going to revert back to barbarism of the World War II. Now, at the government level, the ideas of state-led capitalism became very influential, especially the ideas of Keynes. Again, because of the bad legacy of capitalism, the Great Depression of 1930s, the dominant idea among economists was that you shouldn't leave the economy and the private sector on its own. If you do that, it could lead to bad things. You need to regulate it. State-led capitalism. And at the social level, interesting things were happening. Baby boomers, your grandparents' generation or your parents' generation, right, were born in the Europe and the US, and you had a mass migration from a lot of developing countries to Europe to provide labor force, basically ex-colonies. A lot of labor coming from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan to the UK, for instance, to help the reconstruction of these countries and find better wages here. Okay, let's go to the outcomes. What happened to the growth? The golden age of capitalism, basically, after the World War II. We never had it so good in history. This is GDP per capita growth rates. Look at the growth rates for the UK between 1950 and 1973. The USA was the leading country, the technological frontier. It had the most productive, most technologically advanced multinational firms in the world. And as we mentioned, Germany and France were left behind. Germany and France had the highest growth rates, 4%. Why? Yes?
Was it that,
Linden, yeah?
was it that late bloomer idea?
Sorry?
Was it that late bloomer idea that you talked about last week?
Late what idea? Sorry.
What the term?
Advantage of backwardness, exactly. Remember, going back, imagine all the bridges you built before the World War II are destroyed, right? So you have to start from scratch. The next bridge you built, the first machinery that you import from the US leads to a big boost in productivity because you're way behind. So, but UK, interestingly, if you remember, was very close to the US, their income level. So it's growing at the same pace as the US. But these latecomers, or more backward countries, are growing at a higher pace. Yes? What was the outcome of this era? Low inflation, full employment, and you had income equality. Basically, you had the emergence of mass consumerism. This was the alternative vision to the communist world, you know. A nuclear family, mainly white, of course. Men, women, and 2 kids, you know, having a very happy life, buying consumer goods. Okay. This was the immediate generation after the World War II. However, you know, this is 50s. When these kids grew up, they didn't really like the lifestyle of their parents. So they became hippies in the 1970s. Any idea who's this guy? I would be impressed. Come on. Who? Who said it? Very good. Very good. Idol of my teenage years, right? So basically, they revolted against the consumers, their passive lifestyle of their parents. You know, hence you had the May 1968 in Paris. You know, a lot of counterculture movements in Berkeley. This was the birth of counterculture. You know, spoiled kids. You know, who never had it so good. A lot of economic growth, saying that we don't want this capitalist lifestyle, basically, to their parents. Now, this is the main point, the catch-up story, the advantage of backwardness. This graph is for you just to think about these countries reducing their income gap between the most richest country, the most technologically advanced country, the USA, and the others. So the income per capita of the USA is considered as 100, and you can see the gap here. The UK started, as we mentioned, from not a very big gap. But the other countries, Germany and France, were completely destroyed by the World War. There was a big income gap. and they exploited the advantage of backwardness. How European countries managed to imitate and learn the superior technology from the US. Let's say, the World War II, the US had, especially in the 50s, the most productive automobile firms in the world. What happened then? Any idea? There was two mechanisms to learn the technology. First of all, to invite the US multinational companies to come to your country and invest in your economies. Foreign direct investment. This is one of the ways you can learn the technology. Not by technology, I'm not just saying the machinery, it's the management, the know-how, how you run a factory, how you run a car factory. This is exactly the thing that China is doing right now. It's inviting the leading, car companies in the US to come and create a joint venture, 50-50, with a Chinese firm and produce cars inside of China so that Chinese can learn the management and the technologies, the leading technology and the leading management practices in this industry. The other one is that you simply acquire the license to import their technology. So it's called licensing the technology. These are basically the two ways that you can learn the technology from the outsider. Invite them to come to your country and create a business together, or you buy the copyright of their technology. The third one, which was very common after the World War II, is industrial espionage, right? You send your brightest people to their factory and they steal their products and bring it back to the home. You open up their products and find out how those products are manufactured. This was done by the Japanese and the Germans after World War II, and today is done by the Chinese. Okay. So the mechanisms of the catch-up are really similar throughout history. And this is one of my favorite books. The story of Volkswagen, the Beetle, is the story of catch-up. Adolf Hitler was envious of Henry Ford, because he thought that the Americans are the leading car producers, and he wanted to produce a people's car for Germans, homogenize it. Every German family have the same car, right? And do you know who, by the way, designed this German car? Ferdinand Porsche. So Porsche has a very ugly history in terms of cooperating with Nazis, right? So next time you see a rich kid driving Porsche, have this at the back of your mind. Now, the Volkswagen learned the technology from the leading automobile producers in the US from 1950s and 1970s, right? They reduced their technological frontier. And afterwards, they basically overtake the US. They started to export cars to the US, They outcompeted so that they not only reduced the gap, the technological gap, they started to innovate better than the Americans, okay? And interesting that this car that's supposed to be the symbol of fascism, homogenization of families, became a symbol of liberty, counterculture, hippie, very interesting change of identity. So in a way, if you want to read an entertaining story of German economic miracle after World War II, I recommend this book. Now let me show you this graph about the German story. I don't know why I'm becoming obsessed with this story. I've been debating this story with my friends on the Facebook for the last 2 weeks, so I cannot help it, really. I know. This is what I do in Facebook, right? Okay. Our beloved Gapminder. By the way, you can learn how to see just one factor over time. I'll show you in a minute. So let's go back to 1940, okay? Before the start of the World War II. Now, I'm gonna pick United States and Germany. Now, pay attention here. I changed this to time. So I just want to see what's happening to the income per capita over time. So this is income per capita. This is income per capita. This is time. And I deselect the rest. Yep. Same income level, 10,000, 13,000. Not a lot of gap, okay? Not the same, but we're talking about not a very large gap. Zoom in. Okay, are you ready? Ready? Yes. Ready? Yes. Okay. Now, World War II. Look what's happening right at the start, right after the World War II. The income per capita of the United States is 15,000, Germany 7,000, half of that, okay? Let's go forward. In just 10 years, in just 5 years, the income per capita of Germany goes back to their pre-war level. Yep, 11,000, 11,000. So they managed to reconstruct their country in 5 years. And that's very easy, as we mentioned, because you know already what you're going to rebuild. The bridges have been destroyed, the capital stock, the factories, the machineries, you're going to rebuild them. And that's where the Marshall Plan was so effective. Now, again, the gap, 17,000, 11,000. And by 1970, the Germans reduced the technological gap. Impressive. We're talking about 2 decades, less than 1 generation. They reduced their income gap. That is the story of catch-up development, technological industrialization by learning. Okay, this is a very vivid example of that. Let's go back. Now, what ruins this golden age? Why? You know, what is the change, the big change destroying this golden age? Basically, the quadrupling of oil prices in the 1973. The price of oil suddenly jumps from $4 per barrel into something like $20 per barrel overnight. And anybody knows the reason? Eduardo, yeah? Yeah.
The energy crisis in the US.
But what do you mean by the energy crisis in the US?
So basically, they thought they reached the peak of extraction oil.
If that was true, we shouldn't see a sudden change in prices. This is a very deep factor, so we should see a slow-moving trend. Anybody else? Yes? Deal it done with Saudi Arabia? No. That was 1979. That was in early 1960s. Come on, impress me. We're in SOAS. You know, bit of a modern Middle Eastern history. Yes.
Is it when they said that they stopped, like the Middle
Exactly. Basma, yeah? Exactly. Thank you. Oil embargo. Arab countries refused to sell oil to the US because of supporting Israel in their war, in Yom Kippur War in 1973. So the oil prices go up. This is a big change. At the same time, the Bretton Woods system breaks down. Why? Because as Jonathan mentioned, the whole idea behind the Bretton Woods was that the US pegged its own currency to the gold, and the other countries pegged their currency to the dollar. Now, this system requires one important thing. For the US not to print a lot of money and retain the value of dollar relative to the gold. But the US couldn't do that. It continued to print a lot of money. Why? Because it was fighting a war in the Vietnam, okay? And that was putting a lot of pressure on spending. To meet the spending requirements of the war, the US had to print a lot of money. So they couldn't keep the value of dollar versus to the gold. The value of dollar, of course, dropped, okay? So the Bretton Woods system broke down. The oil prices started to go up. The golden age was over. We had a new order in the world, and we're still living in that new order by a very good margin. So let me start again. What was happening at the international level? World Bank was there, IMF was there, GATT was there, but you had a breakdown of Bretton Woods international monetary regime, as I explained it. However, at the government level, you had a change of ideas. New ideas became influential in the 1970s. The Keynesian ideas, the state interventionist ideas, were going out of vogue. And the new ideas, what we call them today as neoliberalism, free market ideology, I think we could summarize them now in two words: liberalize and privatize your economy. We know what we mean by privatize your economy. That means that, the things that the state do, give it to the private sector, they can do better, right? Transport today in London, many people think that if you want to have a more efficient tube, give it to the private sector. Actually, many of the tube lines are privately owned anyway. And the other one is liberalize. What do we mean by liberalize is basically don't interfere in prices set by the private sector. Don't determine the price of goods and services. Let the businesses do that. However, at the same time, ensure a lot of competition so that you don't have a monopoly situation in the market where, one firm can charge very high prices. So basically, these things go together. You open up the entry, encourage the competition, and let the private sector set the prices. You don't interfere in there. And at the same time, at the big level, you remove the trade barriers of your country. You encourage international competition as well. When your domestic firms face a lot of international competition, they become more competitive. That was basically the whole idea of privatizing a lot of utility firms in the UK. The idea was that they will, because of the competition, they will improve their business and they will lower the price of electricity and gas for the consumers. I mean, at the social level, you had the ethos of, greed is good and individualism. Okay? Now let's look at the outcomes, growth after 1973. US, you had a slowdown of growth. Okay? Basically, this was the leading innovating economy. The pace of innovation has slowed down. This is actually getting worse, right? The productivity growth in our economy is actually reducing. So despite all these hype of, robots taking over, robots, eating our civilization and replacing us, not a lot of things are happening at the productivity level. Okay. Now, notice that Germany, you had the growth slowdown. Any idea why you had the growth slow down in Germany and France? No. Yes.
Because they catch up.
Sorry?
They catch up to Americans.
They caught up, yeah. So they had to innovate like Americans. So basically the pace of growth naturally slows down. The pace of growth kind of converges to the leading economy, okay? So they no longer had the advantage of catch-up. So be careful when people talking about growth slowdown after 1970s, a lot of things happened at the same time. Yes, the policies shifted, we had free market policies, but we cannot entirely blame everything on the policy because at the bigger picture, there was another underlying force. These countries had managed to caught up with the leading economies and they no longer had the advantage of backwardness. So naturally, the growth would slow down anyway, even though policies would have remained the same. So one of the main things, for instance, criticism of Ha Jung-chang, you can mention that he always says that look at the growth rates. You know, after we shifted to free market policies, they slowed down. But other things were happening at the same time, right? At the same time, the technological gap was reduced between the Western Europe and the US. Now, the general features of this era: growth slowdown, frequent financial crises, and the growing income inequality. Interestingly, from the moment that Bretton Woods system broke down, we kind of reverted back to the problems of the early 20th century. A lot of financial crises, a lot of banking crises. I'm not going to explain to you why. This is the other course that I'm teaching, so hopefully, you know, I can teach you these next year. It's called Issues in Development Economics. It's really got to do with finance and development. Now, any questions about the capitalist world? A very straightforward story. Advantage of backwardness, catching up. Well, let's look at the USSR. This is the evolution of income per capita in the USSR from after World War II until the breakdown. And this is the breakdown of growth. This is very interesting. This was one of the most important charts of the Cold War history, the rivalry between, you know, the superpowers. Which one is more economically capable? Now, look at this area. Look at this period, sorry. This was a period that most intellectuals were becoming fond, were falling in love with the communist system and believing that system was superior. Any idea why? What was happening in this era? Yes? Fascism? Nope. So fascism, then what?
The rise of fascism.
Okay, but fascist regimes actually, especially Third Reich, managed to achieve a very high rate of growth. Anyone else? Yes?
The depression.
Exactly, the Great Depression of 1930s. What was, look at a very low growth rate in the US. And the alternative system, the communist system under Stalin, was growing at a tremendous pace. Massive industrialization. Any idea why you had such a high growth rate in these eras?
Because USSR needed to do incredible catch-up.
Sorry?
They needed to do incredible catch-up after the revolution, and because they were under-industrialized.
Exactly. They were very backward. Remember what Trotsky said? He says, you know, let me take a step back. Marx was basically predicting that the revolution would happen in an industrialized country. Russia was not industrialized when the Bolshevik Revolution happened. So basically, they had to industrialize afterwards. They were mainly an agrarian economy. So Stalin, after taking the power, started immediately industrializing the economy, and he was very good at it because he used a lot of brute force. Let's invest a lot in that industry. Let's put a lot of labor in that industry. And it was very effective at that. And that was mainly, this rate of growth was one of the main reasons that Russia was able to fight effectively in the World War II. You had a rapid industrial growth beforehand. And the growth slows down. Again, any idea why? Anyone else? Oh, boys only? Is this a boys only club? Yes?
Is it just conversion to the leading economy again?
Yes. And the other half. They converged, but then what happened? Yes?
With the Cold War.
Yeah. Then what? Anyone else? Yes.
Central planning proved to be inefficient. The US wouldn't do FDI in the USSR.
Inefficient at what? Proved to be. I don't see any inefficiency here.
Okay, so the most effective fridges were made by the Soviet Union were made by the military.
Okay.
Because they had no competition from the private sector, so they had no incentive to improve their methods.
Got their 70%, yet the remaining 30%. I'll let you rephrase the answer. Let's rephrase the answer from the beginning. You almost got the answer, but you didn't.
They lacked the competition incentive of a privatized market.
Exactly, that's the main thing. So, they caught up, you're right, but once you caught up, you need to start innovating. And they were really bad at it. They were really good at innovation in things that they faced the competition in military, sending aircrafts to space. In those areas, they were really good at innovation. But once they caught up, they couldn't really innovate. They couldn't really build a nice washing machine, right? And that is the slowdown of growth. Very good at catching up, bad at innovation. Now, the East Asia miracle story. This is even more impressive than the story of European catch-up. What do we mean by the East Asia miracle story? First, it started with the catching of Japan and then followed up by South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. The first, basically, the country to industrialize till the last one. Let's look at their growth rate of Japan, GDP growth. Again, starting from backward, high growth rates, exploiting the advantage of backwardness, catching up here, innovating in the 80s, actually. Japanese were good at innovating in the 80s, especially in the car industry. I would be impressed if someone can tell me their main innovation in the car industry. Yeah.
The Toyota method, where they involve workers in innovating ideas.
Yeah, but what was their innovation? Yeah.
Kaizen.
Kaizen. What is Kaizen?
Continuously improving.
Sorry?
Continuously improving.
Continuously improving quality management. Yes. What else? Yeah. Total quality control. What else? Very good. What's your name?
Ubed.
Obed. Very good. a just-in-time inventory system, right? They eliminated inventory because it was very costly. Why? Because they were a very small country. Not a lot of land to waste on inventory. So they built up, was not a machine, the physical machine that you can touch. It was a management method called just-in-time. They eliminated inventory. They started producing products when you had a demand from the other side. Just-in-time. But in the 1990s, they had a financial crisis and you had to slow down in growth. Again, how they caught up, imitating and learning technology from the US. Again, the same graph. This time for the East Asian countries, this is basically our benchmark is income per capita in the US. And we are comparing the gap, seeing the gap with other East Asian countries. First, Japan caught up. These Japanese multinational firms learned the technology through licensing. It was mainly licensing and FDI, foreign direct investment from the US. They didn't rely a lot on foreign direct investment. It was more licensing of technology and sometimes stealing the technology. Then Japanese went and invested in South Korea and Taiwan. It's very funny, right? So first the USA demolishes Japan by a bomb, and then after World War II, the Japanese start to learn from the people who massacred them. They catch up, and the South Koreans do the same with their colonizers, right? They go and start learning things from Japan. The same empire that brutally, killed their parents at the beginning of 20th century. Both Taiwan and South Korea learned the technology now from the Japanese companies. Now, interestingly, the same thing is happening in China now. China is learning the technology from Taiwan. Do you know where these iPhones are assembled? What company? Foxconn. Do you know the owner of Foxconn? A Taiwanese entrepreneur who did the exact same thing the Chinese were doing 30 years ago. Now the guy is doing the same thing in China. So China imitating South Korea and Taiwan now. Again, the mechanisms of learning and catch-up have been the same throughout history, from 19th century until today's China. Exploiting the advantage of backwardness. Look at the tremendous story of Japan. Between this growth period, this was their income level at the beginning in the 1950, $3,000, and then in the span of one generation, 30 years, just one generation, parents to the kids, the income increased by almost tenfold. South Korea income increased by 13-fold from 1960 to 2000. Taiwan income increased from 2000 by almost 8-fold. A magnificent miracle story. This is unprecedented in human history, really. Okay. The same thing happened in all these countries. They diversified away from oil. Rather than producing coffees and cottons, they moved to industrial sector and manufacturing. So basically, the share of manufacturing in total income started to rise. Agriculture started to fall from 20% to less than 5%. The manufacturing share of total income rose from about 12% to 30%. And the share of service sector, or transport and communication and construction, remained the same. The story of becoming rich. You move away from agriculture to industry. Same here. in South Korea. The share of agriculture drops from 40% to almost 10%. The share of service sector revolves around 40%. The share of manufacturing increases from 20% to 40%. You cannot find the country that has become rich without industrialization, without structural change, economic diversification. I'm going to speak for a few minutes and we're going to have a break, okay? I'm pressing. Everybody okay? Any questions? Okay. This is basically, I would say, the things I'm going to talk about are probably the most important things of our course. What happens when you become rich? The story of economic development. I'm going to tell you the story of economic development through products. Okay, you change from producing something to another thing. So, what these countries did, they all started from agriculture and commodities, raw materials, exporting coffee, exporting cotton, fruits. And as a first step, they moved into labor-intensive industries. What are the examples of labor-intensive industries? Textile. Assembly of electronic goods. Japan first started by textiles. It assembled electronic goods. Sony started by assembling electronic goods. Samsung started by just assembling electronic goods. The other example of labor-intensive industries are agriculture-related industries. Okay? For instance, you process the coffee, you process the beans, you package the foods. These are very simple things to do. Agriculture-related manufacturing sectors. Furniture, toys. At the moment, China is specialized on these. What do we call them labor-intensive? Because they don't need a lot of technology and machinery. This stage of activity needs a lot of labor relative to machinery. Just look at what's happening at the Foxconn. You had very simple machinery for each worker. Foxconn is where you assemble these things. If you read behind them, what does it say? Designed in California, assembled in China. Okay. Assembly of these is a labor-intensive process. Now, the second part is that they moved from labor-intensive industries to capital-intensive industries and knowledge-intensive industries. I am on page 6 of the handout. So, labor-intensive industries, we discussed them: textile, food processing, footwear, toys, assembly of consumer goods. Now, capital-intensive industries need a lot of machinery. The best examples is steel. Production of steel need a lot of machinery, but also skilled worker. Okay, engineers, high-skilled managers. The other example is production of car engines. This requires sophisticated technology and machinery and skillful labor. We call these capital-intensive industries. The other example of them are, steel, aluminum, petrochemicals, plastics. These all require a lot of investment in machinery. Finally, knowledge-intensive industries. As its name suggests, it requires a lot of skillful labor. Not a lot of machinery, but very educated, very skillful labor. The best example of it is computer chip production. the chip that is basically the backbone of the computer revolution, this thing here. And product design. Product design, I mean the engine design, the design of this computer, and basically even the design of our clothes and our brands. These are very knowledge-intensive industries. Production of semiconductors, software development, all the product designs are examples of these. So basically, all these countries moved from doing very simple things to labor-intensive industries, agriculture-related industries, and then finally to capital-intensive and knowledge-intensive industries. This is the story of development. This is the story of development. You upgrade from agriculture and commodities to labor-intensive and agriculture-related industries and capital-intensive and knowledge-intensive industries. Now let me show you in the graphs exactly the path that Japan resembles this story. Japanese, at the beginning, this is the percentage of manufacturing output. Their manufacturing was dominated by light industries, labor-intensive industries, like textile, food processing, wood products. Building this is a manufacturing. Right. Wood is the raw material, is an agriculture sector, but building the manufacturing is manufacturing. And these days, these are done, I think, in very even poorer countries than China. The stuff you buy in IKEA, all of them are produced by low-skilled workers. Now, Japan moved to heavy industries, to machineries, chemicals, steel. Same story in Taiwan and South Korea. This shows you the share of machinery and chemicals in the overall production of industrial goods. So at the beginning, only 20% of their industrial production were devoted to heavy industries, machineries, and chemical goods. They were mainly dominated in this area on production of consumer goods. Textiles, shoes, toys, the stuff that China is doing today, or it has been doing in the last decade. China is moving now, actually. China is trying to follow the same path. And they gradually moved to more sophisticated industries. Now, I want you to think about this question during the break. Why moving away from labor-intensive industries and to capital-intensive and knowledge-intensive industries can help countries become rich? So basically, why this process helps you become rich. If you specialize, if you move away from this sector to this sector and this sector, why do you become richer and richer? So we have 10 minutes of break. It had several factors, but this was the underlying factor. I'm saying that this is the strongest factor for it to slow down. The other factors accelerate. But if I wanted to ask you what is the main factor, I think it's the catching of black. The others are secondary.
So you're absolutely right. Build backwards ladder. Innovation, because there are sort of yourselves in the vape, because it minimises the trade with the other countries. It also is they all produce really good stuff like the washing machines or whatever. But what is the need for that to have good washing machines? Is it they rely on different labels? What I mean is they produce the good quality military stuff, Kalashnikov guns, etc. But couldn't they be relying only on this? I think it's basically if you build a system that is unable to give basics
not discussing this question with the person next to you. Okay, anyone? What's the answer? Why moving away from agriculture to labor-intensive industries and from labor-intensive industries to capital-intensive and knowledge-intensive industries to make you rich? Just two people? Why?
So my partner and I were saying that the products of capital and knowledge-intensive industries are just more profitable.
More profitable? Yeah.
And he kind of made it twofold because in the agriculture or labor-intensive industries, the products are cheaper to produce, but the profits that you yield from that are also less. And there are just a lot of external factors in participating in I guess, agriculture industry because there are external factors like weather that you have to take into account that kind of affect.
Very good. So basically, these activities are more profitable. Your answer?
And since the professions are becoming more specialized than wages, so those are,
So more specialization.
yeah, are leading to the rise of wages and the income so that people can use more money on consuming and
But why specialization in agriculture is not as good as specialization in labor-intensive industries? Or why specialization in labor-intensive industries is not as good as specialization in capital-intensive and knowledge-intensive industries? Yes?
Because I think with the e-commerce and with e-commerce and with knowledge-intensive industries growing, they can replace humans doing jobs. Like a machine can replace a human doing a job. It makes it so that reduces just any other sort of like personality conflict, like a boss needs to go through with the employee, so they needs to go through with that with the machine. And it's more efficient in that way.
Okay. A second.
Labor-intensive industries allows businesses to produce the same or more products with less resources. The intensive part also, like laborers increase their productivity, which increases business profit, which in turn increases their wages and betters their working conditions, which also has a knock-on effect on the government because they also
Let's just forget about knock-on effect. I think that suffices the answer.
So these industries have more linkages. They produce more innovation, and most importantly, they produce goods that make other industries more efficient. So a labor-intensive industry might make a hoe, which makes agriculture more
I
efficient.
hate complicated answers. I hate what linkages, you know. Anyone else? The last person. Yes?
Supply, so everyone can specialize in supply in the agricultural sector, whilst not everyone can supply in the capital-intensive and knowledge-intensive industry, which leads to there being an excess in supply, whilst, a low amount of supply but an excess in demand in those knowledge-intensive and capital-intensive industries, which makes them more profitable.
Okay, very good. Yes? And you as well. The simplest answer, your award goes to her. The simplest answer. These activities are more profitable than the others. That's it. More income generating than the others. The rest are the causes. You can tell me about 3 or 4 causes why these factors are more profitable than the others. But the simple answer is that these industries are more income generating. High value added industries. The income generated by capital intensive and knowledge intensive industries is much higher than labor intensive industries. The income generated by labor intensive industries is much higher than agriculture and raw materials. That's simple. And the next week's when we're going to discuss why, we're going to touch on the things you mentioned. But let's look at it in real world. Simple example. So basically you move from low income generating sectors to high income generating sectors. That is the story of development. So the next time you're going to Tesco or any electronic goods or you're buying anything, think about who specialized in which part of the production of this good. Then you have the story of development. You also have the history of development there. Samsung started from assembly of mobiles. Now, it doesn't assemble. South Korea doesn't assemble. It focuses on the more difficult parts, the software design, the design of how it looks, the Samsung, how Samsung looks. More difficult stuff. It moved to knowledge-intensive industries. Let me give you examples. In order to find out real-world examples, let's look at how the things we're consuming every day is made of. The production chain of goods that we produce. Let's consider, a Zara t-shirt. It's sold for almost 13 pounds in the retail. This t-shirt is, it takes stages for this t-shirt to be produced and marketed at the retail level. This is called production chain. So what happens for the production chain of Zara? At the beginning, you had the raw material sector, the cotton. Probably many people export this raw material, agriculture sector, from many sub-Saharan countries, the cotton. Next stage, you turn the cotton into cloths. Yeah. And this is mainly done in countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam. The next stage, you sew the cloths together into these, according to the design given to you by Zara. You make the clothes. Finally, once you make them, you deliver it to a retail store in Oxford Circus, and you sell them. You market them. Now, the question is, who gets most of the 13 pounds? Which of these stages? Raw materials, intermediate components, that is the cloth that make the clothes, the cloths. The people who have actually sewed the cloths, or the marketing and retailing? Which part? Raise of hands for the raw materials. Raise of hand for the intermediate components, for the assembly, retailing and marketing. A knowledge-intensive sector gets a higher share of the 12 pounds. It's more profitable. I don't want to say the word profitable, let's say more income generating, okay? Out of the 12 pounds of income, this sector gets most of it. Another good, our iPhone, is sold by 500 pounds. The first stage is, of course, the raw materials that you make the chip. Where's my iPhone, by the way? Oh, here. Yeah. Silicon mainly. This is mainly extracted from which country? South Korea. South Africa. Then, the silicon is turned into computer chips in Texas, USA. Then, the computer chip, together with the other component, the plastic component of our iPhones, goes to Foxconn in China. And this person assembled them together with a very simple technology. And finally, we got our iPhone in the Apple Store, in our retail store, and it's marketed by them. Okay. Who gets most of the 500? Raise of hand for the raw materials. Raise of hands for the computer chip. Raise. 1, 2, 3, 4. Who else? 5. Assembly. Software and marketing. This one gets the most. So only 5 people got it right. The most expensive part in this iPhone is their brain, computer chip. So if you wanted, the next stage for all these countries, for China, is to move away from here to here. The next stage, which is more profitable, is the software design, the marketing, and the retailing of it. This is a capital-intensive, knowledge-intensive part. This is a knowledge-intensive sector. Interestingly, if you look at Samsung, it started from this. Now, it has specialized in these parts. Now it's competing with the US. 40 years ago, it was like China. Now, it has a competitive global firm. Finally, a car, a lot of raw materials, then they turned into intermediate goods. Engine is produced, chassis is produced, doors, light, glasses, and then gets assembled in a factory, and marketing and retailing, which is the most profitable part, raw materials, intermediate components, raise of hands, assembly, marketing and retailing. Raise of hands. I think we got this correct. These 2 parts. The production of engine, which is a capital-intensive industry. And the marketing and retailing of it. But I think this is the most profitable part. So if you're an automobile company in Germany, you don't want to waste your time in here. You mainly specialize on the most profitable part, production of engines and marketing and building image around your car. So basically, that's the idea. You also had my favorite example with the Starbucks coffee. Right. Raw materials, coffee. The coffee gets processed. I don't know whether any of you have really seen the raw coffee. Sometimes you see the pictures in Nero or Costa Coffee. Okay, there's nothing similar to the processed coffee that we buy. So it's like a fruit, actually. It's really like an apple. So they process it. Coffee processing is an agriculture-related industry. Okay, you process the coffee. Then, the coffee gets here. It's marketed. It becomes part of our identity. Do you drink Starbucks coffee or fair trade coffee? The experience. Who gets most of the profit? Any idea? Marketing. The Starbucks gives you the experience. Out of the £2.20 that you pay for your latte, very little of it goes to the people who have actually produced the coffee and processed it. Okay. More is got to do with the branding, the person who connects. Nowadays, it's very interesting. You got the ethical branding, right? Pay higher, then you're a more ethical consumer, It's a very interesting way of tricking people into buying fair trade coffee. So think about it, we buy fair trade coffee, we're actually encouraging, poor countries to specialize in production of coffee. I'm going to pay you something extra, right? Keep on producing coffee. So that I could feel good about myself. So, the idea is simple. Economic specialization. The idea of development is industrial upgrading. To move from not very, I wouldn't say profitable, but low income generating part of production chains in the world, the more profitable ones. It's a story of changing what you produce. Okay? Next time you go shopping, read the labels behind. Okay? That's the story of development. You encounter the story of development in Tesco, in basically your everyday shopping. Now, any questions? Okay. I'm going to jump this part and go to the third part of our lecture. Africa after 1950. Now, the image of Africa has been changing a lot. First, after the World War II, it was, height of optimism. The era of decolonization. All the problem was because of the white man. The white man is gone. We're going to see development in sub-Saharan African countries. Okay, the period of optimism there. Then, by the start of the 1980s, you had a sudden shift of, portraying Africa as a disaster. Let's feed the world, all these charities, all this kind of aid industries and all this celebrity aid sprung up for the first time in the 80s, because of the famine in Ethiopia. A lot of the, rock stars, jump into the bandwagon. And this was the image of Africa as something that is, full of disease, a lot of poor people, a lot of dictators, And the image has pretty much stuck up, really. Then, recently, you had a miracle story. Then suddenly, Africa turned into this high-growth economies, which one is the next tiger? Is it Nigeria, Ethiopia? Yeah, change of sentiment. And nowadays, when the commodity prices have fallen, and most of these countries specialize in the export of commodities, now things are getting ugly again. So the image of Africa is kind of changing again, okay? Now, this is the GDP per capita for the whole sub-Saharan Africa region. Well, basically, you had a tremendous rate of growth, stabilization. This is income per capita. We're not talking about growth. This is income levels. Growth, stabilization. The last decade, the 1980s, actually income started to fall, negative growth rate. And then from the 1990s, income started to go up again. It reaches its pre-level and then goes up and up. the recent African economic miracle story. Of course, there are a lot of measurement issues, with the GDP of many sub-Saharan African countries. Now, let's look at this picture. What does this tell us? Anyone? Basically, this is the world income level, and this is the sub-Saharan income level. You had a bit of divergence here. The rest of the world is growing. Africa is left behind. Then you had the growth. And since 80s, you had a big divergence. Yeah, since 80s, you had a big divergence. So basically, first up, growth, then decline, but this is up to 2000. Let's look what happens afterwards. The last decade, income per capita declines, but then starts to grow at a high pace. So the main lesson is that if you look at through time, the story changes. You had good periods, bad periods, and then good periods again. If we look at the average growth rates, it's misleading because it masks what was happening in different episodes, okay? So if we break down the performance of Africa after 1950 to different decades, we see a variance in the performance. In some decades it was good, some decades it was miserable, in some decades it was very good, okay? So this kind of encourages us not to brush, the experience of Africa as a failure. Now, the second one is that there is no such thing as Africa. I got this from Starbucks. Got that. As this continent, like, I went to Africa, to find myself. We should save Africans. There's no such thing as Africa. It's a very homogeneous. It's a very heterogeneous place. It's a very heterogeneous place. A lot of variation between countries. Look at this chart. This is the income level. The yellows are sub-Saharan African countries. This chart shows you the variation in income level. In this region, you had Mali, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. Then you have Nigeria that has the same income level of India. Then you have Botswana, which is very rich, and it has the same income level of Thailand. So a lot of variation. We cannot pool all these countries together. So when we're discussing what should we do about Africa, the first answer is that what country are we talking about? And the variation is so large. Look at the poverty rate in these countries. This is the poverty rate, extreme poverty rate, percentage of people living below $1.20, which is outdated. About 70% of people in Zambia are in poverty, while in Botswana it's about 15%. A large variation. So the story is not to lump everything together. And you can see this chart about the variation. This is the growth rates of countries between this big period. You got Botswana with a 5% growth rate, Equatorial Guinea, Mauritius. On the other hand, you got Zaire, Madagascar, a large variation. They have negative growth rates. Same here. Any questions? Let's go finally to India and China after 1950. Now, I'm not going to talk about this period. I want someone else to give us the lecture because you all know the story. It's the story of your lifetime. Any volunteers? Jonathan, you want to go at it?
I'm just scratching my arm.
Scratching. Since 1980s, the period of Deng Xiaoping, you had political and economic reforms in China, tremendous catch-up growth, starting from way behind, learning the technologies, how the exact way that South Korea and Taiwanese did. Licensing the technology, espionage, inviting foreign direct investment, starting with labor-intensive industries and moving towards more difficult stuff. You know, Lenovo, China bought Lenovo. Why? Because they wanted to move from just assembling laptops into production of software and computer chips. They wanted to do the more profitable part. They want to do the same things with mobiles. Right? So in a way, they're moving the less profitable part, less income generating part of their business to Vietnam and Bangladesh and focusing on higher income activities. The exact thing that Japan and Taiwan and South Korea did. Of course, for this, you need an educated workforce. And, you know, for innovation at some stages, you know, you need a little bit of liberalization in the political sphere. You cannot tell private sector what to do as before. Well, the story is a little bit different with India. You had a lower growth rate in India. Less rapid catch-up. Any idea why? Yes?
They didn't liberalize as quickly
They didn't liberalize as quickly.
or as strongly.
Did China liberalize strongly?
In some ways, like in terms of the special economic zones, like actually no, I guess.
But is it very good? You made a good point. Special economic zones. What are special economic zones?
So like Shenzhen and stuff, where there are virtually no market and regulation. So like where they completely deregulated the stock markets and whatnot.
Well, no. Let's not get carried away. They were very careful about deregulation. The story of China is incremental reform, really. Now, a lot of people debate the reform. Did they really liberalize? Or did they follow the Japanese model, the South Korean model, which got nothing to do with liberalization? We're going to talk about these issues. But the main thing that comes to many people's mind is democracy and dictatorships. Dictatorships are very good at catching up, at copying. Remember Stalin? Right. They're very good at copying. They're not very good at innovating. They're very good at copying because they can force people to specialize in different sectors, and they don't have to listen to people, you know, in terms of their investment decisions. They make the investment decisions on behalf of people. You know, they don't. You know, the parliament in China doesn't debate the infrastructure projects. Bunch of economists decide that. Say, these sectors, you know, have a higher chance of growth, let's invest in these sectors. But democracies are not very good at catching up. But, however, democracies are better at innovating, and dictatorships are not as good when it comes to innovation. Now, any questions? I want to, you know, end with extras this time. This is something that I started doing from this week. These are like extra stuff for you to do if you like the material in this course. Okay, I always say these things and put these things, and nobody cares about them. That's the reason I discouraged. I used to do them, but I decided to do it again because I saw a lot of positive attitude in this room. So one of the things you can do is, there's an interesting event at LSE today at 6:30. It's about, rich people in poor countries, the emerging tycoons, okay? It talks about, who are these billionaires in, countries like China, Russia, Brazil, and basically what is their background. The interesting thing about this is that these guys are the agents of catch-up, remember. These guys, these entrepreneurs come to the US and say, we can copy this technology. They go to a superior country and say, we can copy this technology and bring it to our country and kickstart this sector. And it could be very profitable. So this is why it's very interesting. It relates to your course. They are agents of catch-up. That has been the story throughout history. Governments support the agents of catch-up, but the main imitators are the entrepreneurs. I'm going to go to that event. The other one is a documentary in the BBC iPlayer. It relates to our previous topic, Industrial Revolution. It's interesting. It is reconstruct the condition of Victorian London in East region, in East London. It's a story of a slum that, they specialize in manufactured goods, and it's about their life. It's kind of a reality, recreating the story. A bunch of people put in that material condition in order to basically learn the history through living that era. It's very interesting. You find a lot of materials of the course in there. It's a little bit slow. You have to bear with it. Now let's finish. Let me summarize the content of today. So I'm going to just tell you a short history of what happened after 1950. Rapid growth to 1973 and then slow down in the West. You had the rise and fall of the USSR. Second, the East Asian miracle, unprecedented. In one generation, the income per capita being increased by 20-fold, 10-fold. It's amazing. All of these catch-up stories have been based on technology learning and imitation and industrial upgrading. All these countries upgraded in terms of structure of their economy. They moved away from producing raw materials and agriculture to labor-intensive industries, agriculture-related industries, and then into capital-intensive industries and knowledge-intensive industries. The story of Africa is always changing, of course, still changing, a post-colonial period of optimism. Then the lost decade, of the 1980s until mid-1990s, and then the revival. Now, we see, nowadays the story is changing again, right? Just follow it in the news. Follow the story of Nigeria, for instance. They are completely crippled with a currency crisis. Finally, you have this amazing story of China and India. In your lifetime, this is in a way the most significant story of development. Why? Because it involves 2 billion people. And it's happening in your lifetime. Thank you.